Web 101, in our previous example, we saw in 8.4 the idea of using grid lines to build essentially a wireframe. And then we would use those grid lines for both column and row. We would use those grid lines to tell the browser how to display our page based on that. Here, this is 8.5, and this is 284, but really I'm going to start pointing here at 286 and 287. This is the grid template. Now, this is 8.5, and you can follow along with this. This is the code that we have on page, or I mean in folder rather, 8.5. This is grid.html. So here, you'll notice this page is a little different. This is the Ch8 Sedona page. You've seen this one before. This time around, what we're going to do is template out our grid for how this page is displayed. Now, how do we do that? First and foremost, it's good to know that here we're doing this grid inside of wrapper. And again, what wrapper is doing is going from the inside of body. So if I scroll down just a little bit, you'll notice right here, it's on line number 78 is the start of my wrapper. And down here on 107, that is the end of my wrapper. So what this is doing is everything that exists inside of the body for this particular page exists inside of wrapper. So all the grid we have to do is defining it inside of wrapper. So if we scroll back up, we've got a couple of things that we have to add here. So we've got the idea of our grid area map. That's what's happening here on lines 17 through 21. What I am saying is that my header element belongs to the grid, and in that grid we'll refer to it as the header. We'll pay this off in just a second. My nav lives inside of the grid area called nav. Main lives inside of main. This is on line 19. Aside lives inside of aside. You can see over here in my Ch8 page, that's that floating, well, not floating image. They don't float in this one. In chapter 7, they floated. This time around, it's going to take up a fraction of my web page. So hold on. And my footer area, you'll never guess, but it belongs to my grid area called footer. What this is doing is establishing an anchor. That anchor is between the name of my element and where in my grid template that element is going to be displayed. So because here I have on line number 17, I have my grid area defined as header, and my header belongs to that. These properties and values that we have for the header selector are automatically going to be added to that section of the page in my grid called header, because here with on line number 18, I have my selector for, or my rather, the grid area for nav. It's going to grab all of this other content for nav, which goes all the way here from line 42 through 60. All of that is going to belong to the nav area in my grid template. So now that we have all of that, we'll look here. It's lines 24 through 30. These 6 lines are everything we need to make the Ch8 page look the way you see it. So what I will, before we get to how we set this up in the code, I will tell you the following things. We are looking at a 3-column layout here. The first column is going to be what you see for the nav over there on the left. Next, the big portion of our page located in the heart of Sedona, that main area, and it just so happens that that area is the main area, is going to be that middle fraction, however much of that page it is that we are taking up. The last one is my aside element. That aside element is going to take up, it turns out, 30-ish% of the remaining amount of that page over here on the right-hand side. So how do we tell our browser to take our viewport, so the amount of space that we can see inside of our browser, how do we tell it to divvy that stuff between all of the viewport that we see there? Well, we build a template. So this is what we see, and right here we have to indicate this is the grid template. So inside of wrapper, the property that we're looking at is grid-template. So here is how the template goes. I'll take it one line at a time, and we'll start at the left and we'll work our way over. So here, the first row of my template is going to be header. The header is going to take up, that's why you see inside of the double quotes, so inside of each of those double quotes would go a row. Now, I have header, 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 because really, like we were talking about just a moment ago, this page is comprised of 3 columns. The column that contains my nav, the column in the middle that contains my stuff, main, the column at the right that contains my aside element. So if you look at header, and you can see it over here in my viewport, it takes up the entire first column. That column is 3 rows. So header, header, header takes up the 3 rows, or the 3 columns rather of that row. Next, I have that 100 pix value over here. That indicates how tall that row is. Next, I have nav, main, aside, and then that is auto for the value. So you'll notice in my next row, I have my nav, I have main, and I have my aside. So this is setting up the template for us. Auto just means that, hey, figure out how tall this stuff has to be. The bottom row I have is right here, and you'll notice that bottom row contains just the footer. Footer, 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 because just like the header, so on the top, my header takes up the whole width of the page, every column across. My footer takes up the bottom full width of the page, every column across. So footer, 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 it has to go across the whole width of the page. Header, 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 that's because it has to go across the full width of the page. Now, I do have to mention that here I have a 50 pixel value for the height of that particular row. Now, this last bit here that starts on the next line with a / is telling the browser how wide each of these columns is. My first column is 150 pixels wide. That's over here on the left-hand side. This area here is my first column. So remember, part of that first column is behind essentially the Ch8 Sedona header. Part of that first column is essentially behind the footer down here too. It's this portion here, but also contains all of nav. My second column is 1 fraction wide. The big portion of whatever's left is that 1 fraction. How do we know what's left? We have this 30% over here, which is it's on this side, it's the right-hand side column, and that is that guided hikes aside element. So what I'm going to do is we'll change some of these values so that you can see where everything ends up. If I change my first column from 150 pixels wide to 350 pixels wide, look at what happens to my nav area here. Because that nav takes up my first column, that 350 pixels width, Look how wide that became. But you'll notice my header, Ch8 Sedona, my footer, copyright, didn't change because it doesn't matter how wide that first column is. Header takes up all 3 columns and footer takes up all 3 columns. So let's change this. We'll go back. We'll change the width of the aside element. So instead of 30%, let's take up 50% of that fraction of the page, of the, inside of our grid template, it is the right-hand most side of our grid. When I give that a 50%, you'll notice, boom, that portion of the page, this side, changes so that you can see what the effect there is. I'm going to move this back to 30% and our page is going to go back to normal. Let's change how tall these elements are so that you can see what's going on. If I take the first row of my template and I make it 300 pixels tall, you'll notice that that area gets much taller. So that's my height property that goes along with it. If I let's change my footer area to 150 pixels tall, you'll notice how big and kind of ridiculous looking my footer area gets. We'll replace that with the original value. There it goes. So this is how to build our template. We would have rows and we have columns. Now, some elements, like our header, elements like our footer, actually take up multiple rows, multiple columns rather. I'm sorry, I reverse everything for you guys. I'm having a little bit of difficulty with that with rows and columns. I shouldn't be reversing those, but I am. So the header and the footer take multiple columns, so they go across the page, whereas nav, main, and aside, each of them takes a single column, and those values, 150 pixels, one fraction here, and 30% are those values that you see down here. I started mentioning it before. I should mention it again here. This / and this last line of the template, it's always the last line of your template, indicates the width of the columns that you have here. So between the width of the columns and the height of the rows, we start to build the size of our template. And I just want to mention it here again. In 8.2, did we have a different way to do this? Yes. In 8.4, did we have a different way to do this? Yes. Here in 8.5, we have another parallel way to do this. You do not use these interchangeably inside of the page typically. You pick one nomenclature and you go with it from there. There's no right answer here, just different answers here.